Hi there, and welcome to the Positive Talk Podcast. Your hosts, Julie and Chuck, are pretty excited about Season 4 and encourage you to settle in. Take a deep breath and enjoy this week's episode while they merge faith and psychology with a twist of encouragement. So, welcome again to the Positive Talk Podcast. Here are your hosts, Julie Homrich and Chuck Allen.
Hi, everybody. It's a great day to find an encouraging and positive word here at the Positive Talk Podcast. As always, I'm joined by my good friend and partner psychotherapist, Julie Homrich. Hey,
Yes. Hey, I'm noticing something exciting
Julie. What's that?
on your arm.
I got new ink. I mean, a 63-year-old old white fat preacher got a tattoo.
He got it so I don't have to say go in peace every episode.
I know. I can just show it to you. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for starting off with that. That's awesome.
I waited until we were recording.
That's really.
Just getting you back
I was wondering
for all
what that
the
was going on about that. That's awesome. So thank you for that, Julie. That's really kind.
Welcome.
And
it looks
as
great.
I was saying, I'm with my smart aleck sidekick here, and thank you for joining me with that. I wish you could have seen the guy giving me the tattoo. So here's the quick story for the podcast listeners.
Yeah.
All right, just a little snippet into my life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula, and my buddy Pastor Mauricio Meneses takes me to a tattoo parlor.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So he points at the front of it, and all it is a ladder.
Oh
that
my
you
gosh.
have to climb up the ladder to go to the second floor to get this tattoo.
Wow.
And then when you go in, I think I sent you a picture of the sign,
Yeah.
which is neon pink.
Yeah.
It says tattoo time with a syringe next to it.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy cow, my left arm's going to fall off when I get done with this.
My husband was like, I thought the prerequisite for pastor tattoos is that it has to be in Hebrew or Greek.
No,
No?
I'm not nearly that hip. I
Yeah.
went with just like the plain old cursive.
It's awesome. It
Thank
looks
you.
great.
All right, so let's get back to the podcast. Thank you for that, Julie.
You're
All right,
welcome.
so today we are talking about a really fascinating subject, and that is,
Mhm.
what does fundamentalism do to our brain?
Yes.
Because it's a thing, right?
Absolutely. And I would encourage our listeners, if you hear the word fundamentalism and that brings up some emotion in you, just stick with us.
Yep.
Because we're going to kind of unpack that and even our own responses to the topic of fundamentalism. So let's start with that. What is fundamentalism, Chuck? I've heard it described as kind of this strict adherence to the basic principles of any subject or discipline, but how would you define it in a religious context?
Okay, so this is kind of the crux of the whole show, right? How do we put it in context?
Mhm.
And I think it's important to recognize that the word in and of itself, fundamentalism, is not a bad thing.
Right.
But in many of our lives, it is.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it has to do with our experience with what we know as modern day fundamentalists.
Right.
Right.
It's
So
how it's played out.
yeah. So to put this into context, the word fundamental could describe any religious impulse that adheres to basic tenets, which in and of itself sounds good.
Mhm.
Right. Well, if the Bible says this, then I do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but this is true in every faith system.
Right.
Right. This is not
Right.
just a Christian thing.
Well, in
Or-
any educational system, anything, there's always
Yeah,
the fundamentals,
Yeah,
right?
it can be the law.
Mhm.
Right? So, fundamentalism, for the purpose of today's podcast and what we're talking about, is a movement within the church that does indeed hold to what we would consider essentials of the Christian faith,
Mhm.
but to a radical extreme.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so, in modern times, today, the fundamentalist is often used in a derogatory sense, and it's well earned.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I grew up in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
I did not have the luxury of growing up or the joy of growing up where I had a pastor that would encourage me to think.
Yeah.
I grew
it's
up with
just
somebody who wanted to tell me what to
what
think.
to think. Yeah.
And,
Not
as
how
a
to think.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so as a pastor today, one of the things that has driven me is
Mm-hmm.
to try to encourage people that, one of the most amazing parts of how our Creator wired us was a brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think He longs for us to use it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and it gives us that ability to really own our own expression of our faith.
Yeah. So with that in mind, fundamentalism, I cannot say that word correctly today.
It's a tongue twister.
Fundamentalism.
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 Yes.
There you go. Fundamentalism, for the sake of today's conversation, I'd like to put it into this light. It is when we weaponize our faith system,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes skewing the words of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and we weaponize it to prove we are right, which is the exact opposite message of what Jesus taught us.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But many folks would describe modern fundamentalists as angry Christians.
Yes.
I know a lot of them.
Yes. Yes. And it's hard because you see somebody expressing such deep anger and yet they're speaking about this deep love and
Yeah.
it can be confusing.
Yeah. It is, because on the one hand, the concept is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Like I want to follow what the scriptures teach me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important for us to recognize that we can hold truth in one hand without sacrificing grace in the other,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the balance of the Christian walk.
Right. And it's like this, I think this is the perfect time for one of my favorite phrases of all time in that fundamentalism. See, it's hard.
It's rubbing off.
It might not be incorrect. It's just
Right.
maybe incomplete, right?
I love
the
that.
way
Yeah.
that, because in so many
Yeah.
things in life, we look at them and we're like, okay, that's not totally
Mhm.
incorrect,
Mhm.
but I think it's a little incomplete. Let's, broaden our view a little bit.
Yeah. And I think this is true. I mean, pastoring a church that's 137 years old,
Mm,
you've got a long, long history, and it has had seasons, even in my own church, where it had kind of a significant fundamentalist bent.
yeah.
And you can see in that period of time where care for people, ministry for people kind of went out the door
hmm
because we were really busy screaming at people.
Yeah. But how exciting that in the life of the church that you can see an evolution, that things
Oh
have
my goodness,
evolved
yeah.
into
Yeah.
less, of the screaming and more of
Yeah.
the serving.
Because I'm living the good old days apart from fundamentalism,
Mm,
but not without law,
Right.
not without truth,
Right.
but genuinely just bathed in grace,
hmm
peace,
hmm
joy,
Yeah.
all these things that Jesus taught. I mean, weaponization of our faith is the opposite of everything Jesus
Mhm.
taught us to do.
What does it used to say? People use like Bible verse hand grenades.
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Yeah,
like,
you pull the
I'm gonna
bin. Yeah.
throw one of those at you, and
Yeah.
and then it just explodes on you,
You know
and
what
you're
my
like,
favorite one is,
"Ah."
Julie? I mean, this is my favorite one, and this is going to tick off somebody. So
Here we-
just
Here we
buckle
go.
up, right?
Yeah, buckle up.
So what I love is when somebody takes the Bible verse hand grenade,
Mhm.
kind of pulls the pin out with their teeth like a Marine, and they
Right.
lob it at somebody.
Yeah.
And when it explodes on them, what they hear is, but God hates divorce.
Uh-huh.
And what I want to do is I want to grab the hand grenade instead of, diving on it.
Yeah.
Grab it in a hurry, put the pin back in it and say, but he loves you,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, but he loves you. I mean,
It is-
God hates a lot of things,
Mm-hmm,
I mean, he dislikes gluttony.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't, there's a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when people want answers and they want
Yeah.
to be able to put very complex situations in boxes.
Yeah, it
So
doesn't
when,
work, does it?
when we throw a hand grenade at somebody, it's like, okay, maybe I don't know what to say, or I'm really threatened by the fact that this is really confusing and messy. So I'm going to try to simplify it
yeah.
with one verse. And what happens is a lot of times people leave instead of feeling empowered and maybe convicted, but empowered by a verse, they feel deflated, they feel
Defeated.
hopeless. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So my experience with this is really personal. This is nowhere in our notes, by the way. But so when my first wife was battling for her life with cancer,
Mhm.
I would show it some places. Some preacher would declare that God was going to heal her.
Yeah.
And what I heard internally
Yeah.
was, I'm going to pull the pin on this hand grenade. I'm going to lob this that makes him feel better.
Mhm.
And it's going to explode on me. But what I heard was, by God, watch this, I'll fix it.
Mhm.
And what I
Yeah.
learned is, no, by God's grace only does it get fixed.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be with me. Don't try to fix
Fix
me
me.
with a verse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Be with me.
Yeah.
Don't try to fix me.
Yeah.
I think that's just, we see that in Jesus's example too.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a therapist, I know you see this in religious trauma a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the areas that I work with clients is religious trauma,
Mhm.
and so I can say that having done a lot of work with people and their real life stories, I've definitely seen some of the downfalls of fundamentalism. As a believer in Jesus and the Bible myself, I can also see, like we talked about, how adhering to a specific belief can be beneficial
Right.
to individuals, and science backs that up as well. So that's what we're going to break down today: is what does fundamentalism do to the brain? Like that's going to be, we're going to kind of mix in the religious, spiritual perspective and the biological perspective here.
Which I think is kind of to use a play on words, the fundamental element of this
Right,
podcast, right? How
right.
does science and faith, how does psychology and faith, how is it a hand in glove experience?
Experience, yeah.
Because the creator merged it. We don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he gave us, of course,
Yeah.
a body and a brain that works a certain way. We're not just spirits walking around.
Right, right.
Right. So I can see again how those specific belief patterns can be beneficial to individuals. But I think the challenge is when fundamentalist beliefs create fundamentalist groups that create this us versus them mentality, developing kind of an in group versus an out group,
Yep.
and then responding in anger when, or judgment or shame when the out group doesn't adhere to their particular set of beliefs. And it's usually a very narrow
Yeah,
set.
it's a funnel system.
Yes.
It's like,
yes.
let me get it as narrow as I can. I would say, being a pastor, that right there is really the element of why the American church is struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Show me a church that has decided we want to take the red letters of the stories found in the Gospels that Jesus said and promote those, as opposed to taking just Old Testament law.
Right.
And using that to create a country club of like-minded believers.
A country club of like-minded believers. Yes. I think many of us who've experienced fundamentalism can say that would be a very clear definition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And, the leading neurotheologist, Andrew Newberg, he wrote a book called How God Changes Your Brain. And it's a fascinating book if you're interested in this. But he says that the neurological problem, this is like our brain, right? The neurological problem of fundamentalism doesn't lie in the firm adherence to a specific set of beliefs. Rather, the problem arises when individuals use their religion to justify those angry feelings toward others, right?
I
or
love
those
that. Yeah.
isolative, exclusive feelings.
Yeah.
So remember, we talked in our episode on mirror neurons. When we watch someone deliver an angry speech, whether that's in a congregation or political arena, then we have that part of our brain, the mirror neurons, they kind of light up.
Yeah.
Right. And they begin to mirror the angry content that we're seeing.
That's so true.
And we have this part of our brain called the amygdala, which we've talked about here on the podcast. And that's the area of our brain responsible to detect threat.
Yeah.
Okay. So that will respond and light up to the emotional expression of others quite easily. So what does this create? It really creates a subgroup of people whose religious expression is fueled, quite literally, on anger instead of love, or anger more so than love.
Wow. Okay, so when I hear that definition, it takes the concern to another level, because to an extreme, then it's not a leap to go from this closed group of kind of angry fundamentalists to violence.
Right.
But it's not always physical violence.
Right.
Like, I think the more dangerous kind is, although this sounds bad, but the more dangerous kind is the kind that shuns others.
Yeah, because it's more subtle. It's not as easily identified.
Yeah, you can't really put a thumb on it and say that you did it, but you did it.
Yeah, and it's those situations where you're like, something's not right here, but it seems like it's clothed in religious context, and I can't make sense of it, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel good in my spirit. It doesn't feel loving, but there's just, yet you can tell there's something off.
Like, I know you and Dan are fans of The Chosen, like Jenny and I are.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love is how Jesus is portrayed, because he doesn't take an fundamentalist position and become equally angry.
Right. And that's super important, right? With
Yeah.
anything that we're exposing or we're highlighting some challenges of a belief system or a structure or construct, it's really hard to not become the very thing that we are angry
Yeah,
about, right?
yeah.
Like if we become so angry at the angry fundamentalists,
Yeah, then we're just an angry anti-fundamentalist, which
exactly.
we haven't solved anything.
Right, exactly. So there's a way, I think, to do this where you're able to identify, but still have even grace and compassion on these people who have, kind of circled themselves into something. They have a reason for it, right? They become
Yeah,
fundamentalists
yeah,
because it feels safe, it feels controlled, it
right.
feels, structured, whatever that
Mhm,
is.
mhm.
So we can have grace for that as well.
So somehow, again, we're nowhere near our notes here right now,
No,
but
that's okay.
um, it does make me think that there's something that is either already there in the brain
Hmm.
that is then fueled
Right.
in the brain that causes somebody to latch onto that,
Yes.
not unlike a cult.
Well, there's brain studies that show that different structures, the size and how often they're used actually determines even people's political affiliation.
Yeah, yeah, I
So,
could see it.
yeah, we're kind of predisposed in certain ways based on our upbringing, based
Hmm.
on our response to threat, to either lean more towards certain
Right.
types of
Yeah,
religion or
yeah,
types
yeah.
of political affiliation.
And again, way off the notes, but I th- I think one of the commitments you and I made that this would never become a political stump in any fashion, right?
Right.
But it is easy to see, like in the American church,
Hmm.
how we have confused our faith with our political beliefs,
Hmm.
which seems to ramp up
Yeah,
this anger.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that, I guess the shift seems to happen when folks become disillusioned with their faith and then feel like church is no longer a safe place for them because
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
group gets closer and smaller and angrier.
Right. And if somebody has questions, suddenly they're in the out group
Wow.
now, right?
Okay, this is my sweet spot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can remember Julie being told, as a young man, I mean, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not even a kid, like a young man, that you should, as a believer, you should never have doubt. You should, I mean,
Wow.
and and me buying it for a
Mm-hmm.
season, liking,
Mm-hmm.
well, so that I'm certain. I'm so dang
Mm-hmm.
certain that I know all things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then I could remember my personal life experiences
Yeah.
and just walking privately with God,
Mm-hmm.
discovering that you don't really have a faith unless you have a doubt.
Right. Right. I relate so much to the man. I think it was written in Mark. I could be getting that wrong, but he asks Jesus to heal his son, and but he's like, if you can. And Jesus kind
Right.
of like, if I can, and the guy says, I believe,
Yeah.
but help my unbelief.
Yeah.
Right. So
Right.
he's being authentic. He's saying, I believe, but there's still a part of me that doubts. And he's in the
Yeah.
presence of Jesus.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, Julie, I pastor a wonderful church, right?
Mm-hmm.
I preach the gospel every week.
Mm-hmm.
I still have doubts about all kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But in that doubt is where I discover God meets me there
Right.
and he strengthens my faith
Right.
even in my uncertainty.
Yeah.
This is the difference probably in being able to live in a more grace-filled Christianity than a
Mm-hmm.
more fundamentalist perspective of only law.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I agree with that. Absolutely.
So let's take a look at something. You in our pre-meeting before we Julie and I talk about these things like 4 or 5 times in 5-minute bites between weeks.
It's just like a little snippet, like, hey, like send a little picture of
Yeah,
something.
well,
You want
part
to
of
talk
it
about
is we're
this?
just too busy,
Yeah.
but it's the story of the old American Native American who
Mm-hmm.
is sitting down with his son,
Mm,
right? And he says, there's a fight going on inside of me. It's a terrible fight between two wolves.
right.
One is evil. He's angry, envious, sorrowful, regretful, greedy, arrogant, all these things. He's filled with guilt, resentment, inferiority, all these things.
Yeah.
And he says, now the other wolf, though, is filled with joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, all these wonderful things, including compassion in the faith.
Yeah.
Right? So he looks at his little boy and he says, grandson, the same thing's happening in you. So the little boy asks the great question. The little boy says to him, he says, well, which wolf will win if
such a
the
great
battle's
question.
raging?
Yeah.
And the older man, I love this, says, the one that you feed.
Yeah. This is really important, Chuck, because we all have two different areas of our brain that fight to respond when we encounter people with differing beliefs, right? So we talk about fundamentalism. A lot of this, where it becomes problematic, is when you encounter somebody who thinks or believes differently than you, right? So we actually have in our brain, two different parts, okay? We have the limbic system, which is kind of the emotional threat response part of our brain.
Limbic.
Limbic, yep.
Yeah.
So Newberg, is the specialist on this, he calls this a pack of wolves filled with aggression and fear, ready to defend anything that could potentially feel like a threat.
Who knew this old grandpa would have this
neuroscientist, yeah. So we have that part of our brain, right? That's there. It can be activated or not. But we also have our frontal lobe and the anterior cingulate system of the brain. Remember last time we were talking, I said anterior cingulate cortex, and you kind of looked at me like, Julie, seriously? And I was like, just call it the ACC. And you're like, thank you. So the anterior cingulate is the part of the brain where empathy, reason, compassion, and logic reside, okay? So these are kind of like those two wolves, right? But it's actually in our brains. And Newberg says that the latter of the pups, like the anterior cingulate, that prefrontal cortex, they're playful. These wolves are playful, imaginative, but they're also what we would say is neurologically vulnerable, okay? And they're kind of slow when compared to that reactive, emotional, limbic part of the brain. So we have a choice, right?
Yeah.
When we're faced with something, when we're faced with a question or somebody who looks or believes differently than us, we can either be very quick and reactive, that limbic system lights up, and we start becoming very protective, very kind of angry, you know,
that is the us versus them that kind of happens.
Us versus them.
Almost instantaneous perspective.
It's fast, right? Yeah. But what we could do is we can actually identify that and learn how to kind of move through that initial response and react from that more loving, compassionate, cooperative part of the brain, right?
So, but when I hear that, Julie, I guess the thing that that really gets me excited about this is that the old story of the two wolves is literally scientifically happening. Right?
Yeah. So we have that selfish, self-protective brain, which is the limbic system, and more of a cooperative one, which is like that, you know, prefrontal cortex and the ACC. And our religious beliefs, Chuck, they will strengthen one area or the other.
Wow. You know, to me, not only did you take me and our listeners to school a little bit on this, because this is really good, it is one more time a perspective of where science and scripture are so in step. Because I'm reminded, we were talking before we started recording in one of the Chosen series, Jesus is about to go to Jairus' home. His daughter's died. And so this very religious rabbi looks at Jesus and says, do not go in that house. I mean, he's like hot, right? And it's interesting. You can see that wolf.
Oh, yeah.
The angry wolf.
Threat, protective.
Yeah, like the pissed off wolf is like,
scared.
I'm coming out, right? So then he says to him, I mean, he gets all fired up, right? And he looks at Jesus and says, if you go near that home, I'm going to write a letter to the Sanhedrin. And I just loved, I mean, Jesus didn't get mad.
Right.
He didn't get angry. I mean, he could have clocked the guy, which is what I wanted him to do, you know? Because, you know, my wolf can be a little aggressive, you know? I like how you agreed with that immediately.
No, I mean, I was actually thinking about myself and just like how we all grow up in environments that either, I mean, if you grew up in a fundamentalist environment, it's been trained.
Yeah, the aggressive is natural.
Yeah.
Right? So, but I watch Jesus and he kind of gets this crooked smile, cocks his head, you know, and then looks at this guy and says, a letter. And then he looks at the three guys with him and says, come on, guys.
Let's go. Let's go in.
But he didn't fight the anger with anger.
Right.
I mean, Jesus in his full humanity in that moment had every right to just fire back, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think this is the model for how we learn to grow and feed this. What do you call, not the limbic system, the other one?
The anterior cingulate.
Yeah. Yeah, I could never say
and
that.
the prefrontal cortex.
The ACC, right?
The ACC, or there's like two areas, like the ACC and the PFC. It's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but we'll just say
Holy
PFC. We'll just say that the PFC. And so, yeah, those are areas, though, that as we learn and as we grow, we begin. I mean, literally, there's the spiritual aspect of it, like the fruit of the spirit coming alive in us, right?
Yeah.
But there's also what we're talking about, which is the renewing of the mind aspect, where we begin to respond less with fear, less with reactivity, and more with love. And this is how God created our brains.
So, like all things that or at least I learned new from you about the brain, is that I'm some ways I'm choosing to feed new neural pathways. In that I'm feeding that more gracious side of me.
Exactly.
And when I feed that, it literally grows and strengthens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it becomes more of your default pathway.
Yeah, which allows us then not to fall into the trap of saying, but that's just the way I am.
Oh, yeah. No.
I mean, that's really lazy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think a lot of people say that because they just don't know if they can believe that it's possible that there's change. And that's a very vulnerable thing to do. Right. So it's a lot easier to just stay very rigid and angry. And this is my stance and this is who I am.
Arr.
Yeah. Wolf. Yeah. So I love Newberg's analogy of these like ravenous wolves versus these like playful pups. You know what I mean? I just think that's so cool.
I do. What I love about it is, so I have two dogs at home, right? So one's Kirby, one's Munson.
So cute.
And they are definitely playful dogs, right? They're not aggressive at anything. I mean, they're just ridiculous. It is amazing to me, speaking of mirror neurons, how I can be playing with my dogs and I can kind of take on their chill,
right?
Which has made them so healthy for me.
Yeah. The same thing happens in fundamentalist environments, though, when you're constantly around people who are fearful and very protective, you take that on. Yeah. And I think that's where fundamentalism can cause severe fractures in relationship because, you know, Chuck, one of the most important elements of healthy interpersonal relationships is the ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, right? And we talked about a few weeks ago, it's hard to have compassion when you're in threat mode, right? You can't, your brain, those areas don't always work well together. It's also important to have the ability to kind of hold mental and emotional space for people to have opposing views while still holding fast to your own views, right? So one area in the brain that helps with this logical decision-making practice is what I mentioned earlier, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We'll say the VMPFC.
That's not better.
Yeah, okay, the PFC. It's just a part of the prefrontal cortex. So I thought this was really interesting because, again, everything that we say here, you know me, I'm finding research studies, like what backs this up.
You are the research geek of all time.
So I'm supposedly an Enneagram 4, but I think I might be an Enneagram 5 because they're like the research.
You definitely bleed over there.
Yeah. I think I'm a 4-wing.
Based on this, you know, bringing up Enneagram. So I am an Enneagram 8, like hardcore, right? So my very nature is that angry wolf. I am living
protective.
Proof.
8's very protective.
Yeah.
But you know what? I wouldn't have thought you were an 8. I would have always thought you were a 2.
Yeah.
And 8s go to 2 in health.
That's
like
right.
When they've really been able to kind of
which
channel.
is my wing, right? My 2 is.
I think your wing has to be like either a 9 or a 7.
Does it have to be on the other side, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So I will say I have grown more into a 2. And I'm living proof that what happens is what you feed will grow. And the new neuro pathways, I am such a different human in this regard than, say, when I was 45. like radically different. I have people that are like, wow, what happened to you?
Yeah. And you're like, oh, we're renewing my mind.
Yeah,
God's renewing my mind.
By the way, I was preaching in Alabama Sunday at a church I'd never been,
Uh-huh.
and I used so much content from our podcast.
Uh-huh.
We had multiple people give their life to Christ.
Yeah.
How cool.
I think it's hopeful for us to recognize that change is possible on a spiritual and physical, biological level.
Absolutely.
So one of the studies that I found that I thought was really interesting, that the VMPFC, whatever we'll call it, the PFC, they were looking at people who had damage to that area of the brain. Okay, and that's the area of the brain that helps with like logical decision making. And these people who actually had damage to that area of the brain, they scored higher in areas of authoritarianism and fundamentalism.
Wow.
So it's like they didn't have the capacity to step outside of that very kind of rigid, perspective. And this makes a lot of sense to me because it takes practice and it takes mental energy to really learn how to kind of stay steady in your own beliefs without resorting to anger when others don't follow suit, right? It's the easy path to just be angry and blame and, create this, I don't know, defensiveness consistently.
Yeah. I think defensiveness is a great term for that because we gird up our defenses and then we turn them into offensive weapons too.
Yeah. And it's like, I think your beliefs are strong enough. Like, I think my beliefs are strong enough that I don't have to sit here and constantly defend them. Like,
agreed.
I can speak on them, but we know that PFC, that area of the brain, it's an area that we can grow in activity and in volume with repeated attention.
Yeah.
So going back to that analogy of the wolves, this means that when we repeatedly choose the way of love and compassion, we essentially starve, those angry, reactive wolves, and we feed the compassionate ones. Now, it doesn't mean that we'll never have, a reactive response.
Sure. Yeah.
Every part of the brain is there for a reason, right? And so in a healthy situation, if you're getting, chased by a bear, I always use that analogy, you want that to
you don't want
react.
You don't
some
want
people
to reach over and try to hug the bear.
Right. Some people act as if they're being chased by a bear when somebody asks a question about their faith, you know what I mean? Or challenges it. So that's when you have to realize, like, this isn't a threat. I love how Jesus modeled this. And we see that in The Chosen. I'm not usually a big fan of like Christian media because I think it's kind of cheesy, but The Chosen is just it. I don't know.
So
There's
good.
Something different about it.
Yeah.
He was so clear, I think, in offering us consistently invitation, as opposed to like coercion. Right.
Yeah. I like that, and it makes so much sense to me. Not only just as a individual human being, but as what I'd like to consider myself a student of Christ and the Scriptures, and so it's a lot easier to take on, Jesus said, take my yoke, it's light and it's easy. And, we always see a yoke as something that bridles you, like with oxen.
Yeah.
If you put it in the context in which it was originally written, you can always put it into today's context, right? So the context then, a yoke was what a rabbi believed.
Okay.
Right. So Jesus is saying, if you take on what I believe to be the truth as the Son of God, then Jesus is saying this way's light and this way's easy.
Okay.
Because he goes on and, like, when asked, well, what's the most important thing in the world? He said, well, just love God and love other people as you love yourself.
Yeah.
And then he throws the whole thing right to the top, and drops the mic after it, when he says, all the other rules that you follow don't matter if you don't get that one right.
Yeah, that is so true.
And so I look at that and I just think to yourself, this was in response to giving him the opportunity to say, what's the most important rule?
Right.
And Jesus basically says, well, the most important rule is don't get hung up on the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's true. I think that's an important thing to think through. And, this in general, this isn't an easy topic to discuss, right? I mean, people, even just talking about things like fundamentalism,
oh man,
it can stir up some emotions. If you identify with that, again, that protective part
Yeah,
is
yeah.
going to rise up, right? If you've been hurt by it,
Yeah.
of course, that protective part is going to rise
Yeah,
up,
yeah.
right? When our brain hears words like anger, fear, selfish, danger, punishment, our threat circuitry goes into action, whether you realize it or not. I think it's important to note that you might be listening to this podcast and your limbic system might be responding, right?
A little fired up.
A little fired up. But this is where we stay with the process. We allow ourselves to move through that
Yeah.
and get to a place where we can actually activate that PFC and learn more
Yeah.
information.
Absolutely. I think it's really good to recognize this big concept that you don't have to always be right. Like God can handle you not being right.
Right, right. That's so true.
You know,
I think, yeah.
I love this picture that God looks at me in all my imperfection and still loves me and loves me enough to have both a rod and a staff to comfort me and to guide me and direct me. But I don't have to put God in my belief system box. As a matter of fact, he doesn't fit there. Right?
Yeah.
I have to believe he can do all things, including change me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And when I do, I'm just reminded of what Jesus had to say. You know, it's like when we get significantly in that fundamentalist mode, one of the first things we do is we point out what's wrong with somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jesus had a great word for this. You know, you might see a tiny speck of sawdust in the corner of the person across the aisle from you.
Yeah.
But don't worry about that while you have a telephone pole sticking out of your eye. You know?
Yeah. And fundamentalist structures actually kind of trick our brain into believing that it's a log in their eye and a
Yeah.
speck in ours.
Yeah.
Because again, we're looking for threats,
Yep,
right?
yep.
So we perceive that as a threat and
Mhm.
we're in that self-protective mode. We
Yeah.
perceive any difference in belief as a
Well,
threat.
we get scared to death of you use this term in preparation. We get scared to death of the skeptic.
Yes. Okay. So this is one of my absolute favorite things that I've learned throughout the course of this whole podcast. Okay. And
Yeah.
when I was researching for this topic, I came across this and I actually sent it to my husband and I said, this is going to be really important for us to be able to identify for our kids, you know, as they grow in their faith. Because I have 2 kids and they both are deep thinkers in different ways. Very,
I wonder where they got that from.
yeah, but because of that, I think that there's this tendency, you know, my oldest the other day he did a whole presentation about why he should go to a different continent. He's 10. He had the flags all listed out.
That's awesome.
He went through every country and he said, here's why this country, because, you know, they have poverty and it'll help increase awareness for me. And, you know, he went through all the budget of everything, right? But he got to Israel and he said, I really want to go to Israel.
Wow.
He said, because, you know, the Bible and stuff. And he said, and I think I believe the Bible, but even if it's not true, it's a really good story.
Wow.
So
Okay, that's pretty cool.
He struggles with kind of, you know, skepticism sometimes,
yeah.
right? So I think this is a really important distinction, Chuck. And I'd never heard this before, but we can untangle skepticism and cynicism.
Oh,
we
wow.
think they're
Yeah.
the same thing.
But they're not.
But they're not. So one important distinction in the process of untangling fundamentalism from faith is to distinguish between skepticism
Yeah.
and cynicism. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes in the church, specifically in fundamentalist environments, we are quick to throw stones at anyone that we label as a skeptic. We're like, oh, they're just a skeptic, right? But in reality, skepticism is just open-mindedness and the ability to suspend judgment until both sides of an argument are considered, okay? So from a brain science perspective, this type of approach actually strengthens that frontal lobe, that
Wow.
PFC,
Yeah.
okay? Now, cynicism is a little bit different. It moves us away from openness into anger, distrust, rejection that can easily become hostility, right? So skepticism can lead to growth, but cynicism shuts it down.
Yeah.
And research shows that cynicism also has negative neurological effects. Now, Newberg calls it dangerous. He says that it can even shorten your life. Cynicism.
Yeah.
It's different than skepticism, though, and I never understood the difference before.
This is a whole nother podcast probably.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what my mind immediately rushes to is in the scriptures, doubting Thomas would be a skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, Jesus, no, I don't know where you're going. Like, Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
can I touch those holes in your
Yeah,
hands? Right.
yeah,
And does Jesus ever get angry with him?
yeah.
No, it's like, dude, here.
Here, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he understands that he's curious.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you take like the Pharisaical rabbis,
Mm-hmm.
who they had zero curiosity,
Yeah.
which caused them to be a cynic.
Cynic, yeah.
And in their cynicism, they became something that was more than a cynic.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden they got over into this world of not being cynics, but being so deep in it that they had zero room for curiosity.
Yeah.
They had zero room outside of their certainty, and the cynicism became just brutal.
And cynicism is dangerous for you, when you become cynical, because the core belief in cynicism is change isn't possible.
Yeah.
Skepticism is I'm trying to evaluate and determine and be open to what could happen. I'm not going to just accept something at face value.
Yeah. Which is really healthy, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, again, going back to Thomas,
Mm-hmm.
what did Jesus say? Oh, blessed are you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But of the cynic in the Pharisee, you brood of vipers.
Yep.
I know which one I want on my resume.
Yeah. Brood of vipers.
Yeah.
It's a
I don't want
very
in that crowd.
dramatic word.
Yeah. I don't want to be in that crowd.
No.
Yeah. So knowing that this just resonates with me, I think one of the things as we try to wrap toward the end of our talk is God can handle our doubts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like he can handle our doubts.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe there are times we break his heart when we throw his words out with self-righteous certainty,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which is kind of a real guard for us. Because it's easy, right? I mean, especially if you're kind of fanatical of your faith.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I'm taking this hard line.
Yeah. And there's a difference, again, between believing something with everything that you are and, like you talked about earlier, weaponizing that towards someone else.
Yeah. So I guess looking at this, I think to myself, when I weigh the pros and cons of fundamentalism in the church, it's pretty important to consider both its positive and its negative potentials, which is not a bad way to look at everything.
Right.
But fundamentalism can offer certain benefits for sure, because it's something to cling to, it's something to hold to, it's something concrete. Right. But ultimately, it carries with it some significant risks that we should not ignore.
Exactly.
And those risks are that you shut that part of your brain down that is curious about what God could do, what you could do, about what we can become.
Yeah. Well, and that's, we think of faith like a child, right? Children are just so inherently curious.
Yeah.
And that's a piece that I think we can lose sometimes as we grow older.
Yeah. I love it when my grandkids get on the why roll. Yeah, but Pop, why? But why?
Oh my gosh. My oldest went through one of those. And finally, one day I just looked at him and I was like, why not?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
There's nothing else I can say right now.
Which, by the way, so that is so funny you brought that up. I have a teaching series coming up soon that's just called Yes and then a period. Why not? Question mark.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. Why not? Like, can't you imagine Jesus looking at all these 5,000 men and all the more thousands of women and children, and Philip's like, dude, we got no food. This is not good. These people are going to go bat crazy, right?
Yeah.
And could you imagine Jesus looking at us? Yeah, why not? Let's just feed them.
Yeah. Why not?
grab a couple fish and loaves. We got this.
Yeah.
Why not?
It's an openness.
That's how cool is that to live life in that journey, though? I mean, it's really a joy. So, Julie, give us kind of your final thoughts on this before we wrap up today.
I would just say that, again, thinking in terms of fundamentalism and how this affects the brain and how this affects your relationships, I would say it's okay to hold fast to your beliefs, but I think we just need to be aware and conscious if that turns into anger,
Yeah.
if it turns into isolating, if it turns into an us versus them mentality, and kind of remind ourselves that we do have it within our power to make some shifts in
Yeah.
how we're
Yeah.
choosing to think these things. Now, if you're stuck in a fundamentalist environment and you're kind of curious and wondering, it's hard because you can't exactly bring these questions to the people within your church, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you will experience
you will
the
experience
danger of fundamentalism.
the danger
when
of
you do.
fundamentalism.
Yeah.
So I would suggest, looking at resources where you feel like the core tenets are things that you believe in, but who also have an openness to a more grace-based approach. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that you would necessarily try to shift the structure from within if it's fundamentalist.
Right.
That doesn't usually work. You need to be able to get yourself into a place of safety
Yeah.
and security before doing
From a
something
pastoral
like that.
perspective with that regard, I would say most people, if they know they're in that environment and it's beginning to feel toxic to you, a change of venue can rapidly shorten the distance from where you are to health.
Yeah,
And
because
I
again,
think
we
sometimes
associate
it's
things.
necessary.
Yeah.
And it's I find this to be fascinating that when we seek a change in geography to help us get mentally, emotionally, and spiritually healthy, we know it when we're there.
Yeah.
I mean,
You can feel it. Your nervous system feels different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Julie, as always, thanks. These are really, really helpful topics that we tackle here on the Positive Talk podcast. And I want to invite everybody, make sure you join seasons 1, 2, 3, and now season 4 of all of our shows. You can find them on our website, which is positivetalkpodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook and on Instagram. And you may not know this if you're just one of our thousands of listeners, but you can watch this behind the scenes on a video on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and
do
search
it for the
Positive
tattoo.
Talk Podcast,
do it to see Chuck's tattoo.
I want you to just watch a little video and
I'm getting
see
him
what
back
it's like.
for all the times he's made me uncomfortable.
So just as we wrap this up and try to avoid any more tattoo talk, I would just say that Julie was one of the first people that I shared this with. And I think her first question to me was, is it real?
Is it real? I thought you were joking.
And no,
you were joking.
The old man still got game.
Yeah,
So,
my husband was like, "Does he have to wear a sleeve when he preaches?
No,
like, what
no.
is he ever
I
going to
preached
be?"
in short sleeves the other day, and you know what's fun, Julie? I finish every sermon saying "Go in peace."
Go in peace.
So now I have to do it with my left arm, so that I go in peace.
Go in peace. I love it. It's it's a great tattoo. It really is.
Thanks. I appreciate it, and I think you were sincere about that.
I am sincere.
That's
and I
awesome.
love it because now I'm going to have you finish the podcast.
You're totally off the hook.
Saying what?
Go in peace. Hey, guys, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you back next week. And don't forget to share these with friends and family. We're out. Go in peace.
Thank you for joining the conversation on this week's Positive Talk podcast. You can always find seasons 1 through 3 on our website at positivetalkpodcast.com. If Julie and Chuck shared something that inspired or encouraged you, please share this episode with friends, family, and your social media platforms. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at Positive Talk Podcast. As always, thanks for joining us and go in peace.